Montana Territory, 1879. The red glow of dawn stretched across the horizon like a wound, painting the distant mountains in hues of crimson and gold. Jackson Lawson stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, watching as the early light revealed the vastness of his land. 5,000 acres of rolling plains and valleys that felt like a prison rather than a home. 3 months since burying Charlotte, and the emptiness inside him had only grown deeper, like the drought-cracked earth beneath his boots. At 25, Jackson was younger than any rancher for 50 miles, his face still unlined save for the permanent furrow between his brows. The Silver Creek Ranch had been his father's dream, passed down too soon when a cattle stampede claimed both his parents 5 years ago. Then Charlotte had come along, the schoolteacher from back east with her books and dreams, making this harsh land bearable for 2 beautiful years before childbed fever stole her away. "No use dwelling," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his sandy brown hair. The morning chores wouldn't wait for his grief. His men were already moving about the property, preparing for the day's work. Jackson had cattle to tend, decisions to make, and a property to maintain, alone. The thought settled heavily in his chest as he descended the porch steps. Alone was safer anyway. The Montana Territory took everything eventually. Best not to give your heart to anyone or anything that could be snatched away. He'd learned that lesson twice now, paid for it in blood and tears. "Morning, boss," called Hank, his weathered foreman approaching from the barn. "Blackwell's heading into town for supplies. Any other business needs handling." Jackson paused, remembering the small envelope tucked in his desk drawer. Actually, yes, the payment for Widow Huang. She worked the last 2 weeks before, he cleared his throat, before Charlotte passed, never paid her wages. Hank nodded solemnly. "The Chinese woman lives in that little place by the creek south of town." "I'll handle it myself," Jackson said. "Been putting it off too long already." Hank's expression shifted, concern etching deeper lines in his leathery face. "You sure?" "Haven't gone beyond the property line in weeks." "It's just a quick ride," Jackson said, the defensiveness in his voice betraying him. The truth was he'd avoided town, avoided neighbors, avoided anything that might require conversation about Charlotte. "I'll head out after I check the south pasture." The older man nodded, knowing better than to argue. "Fair enough, we'll manage here." Jackson turned toward the corral where his chestnut gelding waited. Yes, this was better: action, movement, purpose. Anything to keep the silence at bay, even if only for a few hours. By midday, Jackson had ridden the south pasture boundary, confirmed the cattle had water, and instructed the hands about a section of fence that needed repair. His saddlebags now carried the envelope with the widow's wages, $15 for 14 days of cooking and housekeeping. Charlotte had insisted on hiring her, saying the ranch house needed a woman's touch while she prepared for the baby. Now both Charlotte and their son were gone, buried on the hillside overlooking Silver Creek. The road to town stretched before him, and for a moment Jackson considered turning back. What was the point in facing people, in enduring their pitying looks? But something drove him onward. Perhaps it was guilt at having left the widow unpaid for so long, or maybe it was simply that Charlotte would have wanted him to do right by the woman who had cared for their home. He steered his horse off the main road at the fork that led south of town toward the creek. The widow lived in a small dwelling near where the Chinese railroad workers had once camped. Most had moved on after the tracks were laid, but a few remained, finding work where they could despite the prejudice that followed them. Jackson had never been to her home before. Charlotte had hired her through the Reverend's wife, who organized charitable efforts for the Chinese community. As he approached the small, weathered cabin, he was surprised to see a well-tended garden beside it, with neat rows of unfamiliar vegetables stretching toward the creek. The cabin itself was humble but meticulously maintained, its wooden walls weathered gray by Montana seasons. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and laundry hung on a line strung between 2 posts. It was a far cry from the dirty, crowded conditions many assumed the Chinese lived in. Jackson dismounted and secured his horse to a hitching post fashioned from a young tree trunk. As he approached the door, he heard a sound, a soft, lilting voice speaking words he couldn't understand. He paused, suddenly conscious of his intrusion. After a moment's hesitation, he knocked on the wooden door, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon. The singing stopped abruptly. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened to reveal Fei-Yen Huang, widow of a railroad worker who had died in a blasting accident 2 years prior. Jackson removed his hat, surprised by the clarity of her appearance in his memory. She was younger than he'd realized, perhaps only 20 or 21, with long black hair pulled back in a simple style. She wore a blue cotton dress of Western cut, though he remembered Charlotte mentioning she sometimes wore traditional Chinese clothing at home. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her English accented but clear. Her dark eyes widened slightly, suggesting she hadn't expected to see the rancher himself at her door. "Mrs. Huang," he replied with a nod, "I've come to settle your wages." "For the work you did before," he paused, unable to complete the sentence. Understanding crossed her face. "Before Mrs. Lawson passed, I am very sorry for your loss." Jackson nodded stiffly, reaching into his saddlebag for the envelope. "It's $15, should have gotten it to you sooner." But before he could hand her the money, a high-pitched mewling sound came from inside the cabin, followed by another and another. Fei-Yen glanced back over her shoulder, then turned to him with an apologetic smile. "Please, one moment." She disappeared inside, leaving the door ajar. Jackson stood awkwardly on the threshold, unsure whether to wait or call after her. Curiosity got the better of him, and he peered through the open door. The interior was simple but immaculate, a small table with 2 chairs, a cooking area, a bed in the corner with a colorful quilt. But what caught his attention was Fei-Yen, kneeling beside a wooden crate near the hearth, speaking softly in Chinese. As she shifted, he saw the source of the mewling, 5 tiny kittens, their eyes barely open, squirming and crying in the box lined with cloth. Fei-Yen dipped a small rag into a bowl of milk, then gently pressed it to the mouth of one of the smallest kittens, who began to suckle eagerly. "The mother was killed by a coyote yesterday," she said without looking up, apparently aware of his presence in the doorway. "They are too young to survive alone." Jackson remained frozen, watching as she methodically fed each kitten, her movements gentle and sure. Something about the scene, her tenderness, her patience, the way she murmured encouragement to the tiny creatures, struck him deeply. "Please come in," she said finally, looking up at him. "I must feed them every few hours, they have no one else." Almost against his will, Jackson stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The cabin was warm and smelled of unfamiliar spices and herbs that hung in bundles from the ceiling beams. "I've never seen kittens so small," he said, for lack of anything better. He moved closer, curious despite himself. "They are 7 days old, too young to lap milk themselves." She finished with the last kitten and looked up at him. "Would you like to hold one?" Before he could refuse, she lifted a tiny tabby kitten, no larger than his palm, and held it out to him. Reflexively, he cupped his hands, and she placed the warm, wiggling creature into them. The kitten mewed pathetically, its tiny paws kneading the air, its eyes still mostly closed. Jackson felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen solid since the day he'd laid Charlotte and their infant son in the ground. "They're fighters," Fei-Yen said softly, "even the smallest one. They do not know the odds are against them, they only know to keep trying." Jackson looked down at the kitten, then back at the woman. Her face was serene, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, the look of someone who had faced her own battles and survived. "Here," he said finally, awkwardly extending the envelope with his free hand. "Your wages." She took it with a nod of thanks, tucking it into her pocket without checking the amount. "Would you care for tea, Mr. Lawson? The kittens will sleep now that they are fed." He should refuse, he had work waiting back at the ranch. He hadn't spent more than 10 minutes in anyone's company except his ranch hands in months, and yet, yes, he heard himself say. Tea would be fine. As Fei-Yen busied herself at the hearth, Jackson carefully placed the kitten back in the box with its siblings. The tiny creatures piled together in a heap of multicolored fur, already falling asleep. "You've been caring for them since yesterday?" he asked. She nodded as she hung a small kettle over the fire. I found them crying beside their mother on my way back from gathering herbs. I could not leave them. Must be a lot of work. Life is precious, she replied simply, even small lives. The words hung in the air between them. Jackson looked away, uncomfortable with how deeply they resonated. What would Charlotte think of him now, a shell of the man she'd married, letting the ranch run itself while he moved through his days like a ghost? Your ranch, Fei-Yen said as she set out 2 cups. It is well. Well enough, he answered. Cattle are healthy, lands holding despite the dry spell. She nodded. Mrs. Lawson spoke of it with pride. She said it was the most beautiful place in the territory. Jackson swallowed hard. You talked about the ranch. While we worked, she loved to describe the view from your home, the way the light changed across the valley. She said on clear days, you could see all the way to the mountains, and it made her feel like the luckiest woman alive. Something tightened in Jackson's chest. Charlotte had never told him that. She was looking forward to showing your son all of it, Fei-Yen continued softly, then stopped herself. Forgive me, perhaps it is painful to speak of her. No, Jackson said, surprising himself. It's good to hear. What else did she say? As Fei-Yen poured the tea into simple cups, she shared small fragments of conversations with Charlotte. How she'd planned to plant a flower garden once the baby was born, how she'd saved fabric to make curtains for the nursery, how she'd laughed about Jackson's attempts to build a cradle himself rather than ordering one from the catalog. Each memory was like a small gift, pieces of Charlotte he hadn't known existed. For the first time since her death, remembering her didn't feel like being stabbed. Instead, there was a bittersweet comfort in hearing how she had appeared through another's eyes. She was kind to me, Fei-Yen said as they finished their tea. Many in town look through me as if I am invisible. Mrs. Lawson saw me as a person. Jackson nodded, understanding better now why Charlotte had insisted on hiring her. Well, I should get back, he said finally, rising from his chair. Thank you for the tea. Thank you for bringing my wages, she replied, following him to the door, and for sitting with me. At the threshold, Jackson paused, looking back at the box of kittens. Do you need anything? For them, I mean. She seemed surprised by the question. More milk, perhaps. It is a long walk to town. I could bring some tomorrow, he offered, the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully thought them through. From the ranch. We have plenty. A small smile touched her lips. That would be very kind, Mr. Lawson. As he rode back to Silver Creek, the afternoon sun warm on his shoulders, Jackson found himself thinking of those tiny kittens, determined to live despite everything. And of the woman who refused to let them face the world alone. Perhaps there were still things worth caring about in this harsh territory after all. True to his word, Jackson returned the next day with a small milk can secured in his saddlebags. He told himself it was simply the decent thing to do, helping a widow care for orphaned creatures. But a deeper part of him acknowledged the strange peace he'd felt in her cabin, a respite from the emptiness of his own home. Fei-Yen greeted him with surprised pleasure, ushering him inside where the kittens were more active today, squirming and mewling with greater strength. They grow stronger, she said as she accepted the milk. Even the smallest one ate well through the night. Jackson removed his hat, hanging it on a peg by the door with an ease that suggested he'd done it before, though he hadn't. Good news, then. Would you like to help feed them? She asked, already preparing the rags she used to let them suckle. He should decline, make his excuses, and return to the ranch. Instead, he found himself sitting beside her on the floor, following her instructions on how to hold the rag so the tiny kitten could nurse from it. The creature's determination was remarkable, its tiny paws kneading against his fingers as it fed. You have a gentle touch, Fei-Yen observed, not what one expects from a rancher. Jackson felt a flush creep up his neck. Used to help birth calves, guess it's not so different. She smiled, a quick bright thing that transformed her face. Life begins the same way for many creatures, small and vulnerable, needing protection. They worked in comfortable silence, feeding all 5 kittens. Afterward she again offered tea, and again he accepted. This time their conversation ranged more widely, from the weather to the changes in the territory as more settlers arrived. Fei-Yen told him about her journey from China 6 years ago, coming to join her husband who had been working on the railroad. They had barely a year together before the blasting accident took him. "Why stay?" Jackson asked. "Must be lonely out here." She considered this, looking out the small window toward the creek. "At first I stayed because I had nowhere to go, then because I had made a place for myself, small as it is. I grow vegetables that I sell to the hotel kitchen. I sew for some families in town. I gather herbs and make medicines that even those who dislike the Chinese will buy when they are ill enough." Her resilience impressed him. Surviving alone as a Chinese widow in Montana territory required a strength he'd never considered. "And you?" she asked. "Your ranch, it is your family's land." "My father's dream," Jackson replied. "Came out here from Pennsylvania when I was 10, built it from nothing. After he and my mother died, it was just me until Mrs. Lawson," she finished gently. He nodded, staring into his tea. "Thought we'd grow old there together, raise children to take it over someday." He gave a humorless laugh. "Frontier has other plans, I suppose." "The frontier takes," she agreed, "but it also gives. There is space here to become something new." Jackson left shortly after, promising to return the next day with more milk. As he rode home, her words echoed in his mind, space to become something new. He wasn't sure he wanted to become anything other than what he'd been with Charlotte. But for the first time in months, he found himself thinking about a future rather than just enduring each day. That night, he walked out to the graves on the hillside and stood there as the stars emerged above the valley. "I paid her wages," he said aloud as if Charlotte could hear him. "The Chinese widow, Fei-Yen," the name felt strange on his tongue. "She told me things about you. Things I never knew." The night wind was his only answer, rustling through the grass. But somehow the silence felt less empty than before. Over the next 2 weeks, Jackson fell into a new routine. Each afternoon, after seeing to the most pressing ranch work, he would ride to Fei-Yen's cabin with milk and sometimes other supplies, fresh eggs, a loaf of bread from his cook, a piece of salted meat. Each visit lasted a little longer than the one before. Together they watched the kittens grow, opening their eyes fully, beginning to stumble around on unsteady legs, developing distinct personalities. The run of the litter, a small gray tabby, became Jackson's particular favorite, fighting hardest for its share of milk. Through these visits, he found himself talking more than he had in months. He told her about Charlotte, about the baby son who never drew breath, about his parents and the legacy they'd left him. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in China, her marriage, her struggle to find a place in this new land. Each story was a small thread connecting them. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss. His orders were clearer, his presence more consistent. He began joining them for meals again rather than taking a plate to his room. Hank watched these changes with quiet approval, though he never asked where Jackson disappeared to each afternoon. It was Fei-Yen who finally addressed what was happening between them, on a day when spring was giving full way to summer, the creek running high with snowmelt from the mountains. "People will talk," she said as they sat on the small bench outside her cabin, watching the kittens explore the grass under their watchful eyes. "A white rancher visiting a Chinese widow. It is not proper." Jackson shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't considered how their meetings might appear to others. In truth, he'd barely considered that anyone else existed. "Does that bother you?" he asked. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes serious. "It is you who has more to lose, Mr. Lawson. Your standing in the community, your business relationships." He considered this. The ranching community was tight-knit and, like most of the West, suspicious of outsiders, particularly the Chinese. But something in him rebelled at the thought of ending these visits that had become the center of his days. "I don't much care what people think," he said finally. "Never have." A small smile touched her lips. "That is not entirely true. But I appreciate the sentiment." The kittens tumbled over each other in the grass, playing with increasing coordination. Soon they would be independent, able to hunt mice and fend for themselves. Jackson realized with a start that once they no longer needed care, he would have no reason to continue his daily visits. The thought left him unexpectedly cold. "I should get back," he said abruptly, rising from the bench. "Got a cattle buyer coming tomorrow. Need to prepare." Fei-Yen nodded, standing as well. "Of course, thank you for the milk." As he turned to leave, the small gray kitten pounced on his boot, attacking the leather with fierce determination. Despite himself, Jackson smiled, bending to scoop up the tiny warrior. "This one reminds me of you," Fei-Yen said softly. "Small but very brave." Jackson looked at her, startled by the personal observation. "Me. To face each day after such loss. It requires courage." She reached out, briefly touching his arm, "more than you perhaps realize." The simple touch, the first physical contact they'd shared, sent an unexpected warmth through him. For a heartbeat, he found himself looking at her not as Charlotte's former housekeeper or even as a friend, but as a woman, young, beautiful in her quiet way, and somehow seeing parts of him he thought he'd buried with his wife. "Tomorrow, then," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded, taking the kitten from his hands. Their fingers brushed, and again that current passed between them. "Tomorrow," she agreed, but there would be no tomorrow. As Jackson rode back to Silver Creek, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. By nightfall, a fierce summer storm had broken over the valley, turning the creek into a raging torrent and the roads into muddy rivers. For 3 days the rain continued, keeping Jackson confined to the ranch as he and his men worked to secure livestock and repair wind damage. His thoughts constantly strayed to Fei-Yen's cabin, situated so close to the creek. Had the water reached her door, were she and the kitten safe? On the 4th morning the sun finally emerged, revealing a landscape transformed. Fields were flooded, trees downed, and the creek had carved a new, wider path through the valley. Without waiting for breakfast, Jackson saddled his horse and rode out, taking the main road where it was passable and cutting across higher ground where it wasn't. As he crested the hill overlooking the creek, his heart sank. The water had indeed risen well beyond its banks. Where Fei-Yen's cabin had stood, he could see only the stone chimney and part of one wall still standing. The rest had been swept away by the flood. Panic seized him as he urged his horse down the slope, slipping and sliding through mud. "Fei-Yen," he called, his voice swallowed by the still rushing water. He dismounted at what remained of the cabin, sloshing through knee-deep water to search the wreckage. The furniture was gone, the garden washed away. No sign of the wooden crate that had held the kittens, no sign of Fei-Yen. A terrible hollowness opened inside him, worse than the grief he'd felt for Charlotte, because this was fresh, immediate, and possibly preventable. If he'd stayed with her when the storm approached, if he'd insisted she come to the ranch for safety. "Mr. Lawson." The voice came from behind him, so unexpected that for a moment he thought he'd imagined it. He turned slowly, hardly daring to hope. Fei-Yen stood on the road, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and damp around her face. At her feet was a large basket, and as he watched in disbelief, a small gray head poked out from under the cloth covering it. Relief crashed through him like a physical force. Without thinking, he crossed the distance between them in long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She stiffened in surprise, then gradually relaxed, her hands coming up to rest lightly on his back. "I thought you were gone," he said hoarsely, suddenly aware of how improper his action was but unable to release her. "The cabin. We left before the worst came," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "The Reverend's wife offered shelter when the rain began. I took only what I could carry." Jackson finally stepped back, though his hands remained on her shoulders as if to reassure himself she was real. "The kittens." She smiled, gesturing to the basket. "All safe. They did not enjoy the rain, but they are unharmed." He looked past her to the ruined cabin, reality setting in. Everything else. Her smile faltered, "Gone. But possessions can be replaced. Lives cannot." The philosophy was admirable, but the practical reality was stark. She had lost her home and livelihood in one night. The vegetable garden that provided both food and income was destroyed. The herbs she gathered and sold were washed away. "You'll come to Silver Creek," he said, the decision forming as he spoke. "I have plenty of room. You can stay as long as you need." Fei-Yen's eyes widened. "That would not be proper, Mr. Lawson." "Proper be damned," he said with uncharacteristic vehemence. "You need a place to stay. I have one. The ranch hands' wives can act as chaperones if anyone cares to gossip." She looked at him for a long moment, then at the remains of her home. "Perhaps for a few days," she conceded, "until I can make other arrangements." Jackson nodded, relieved. He helped her secure the basket of kittens to his saddle, then lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode toward Silver Creek, he was acutely aware of her back pressed against his chest, her hair occasionally brushing his chin when the wind blew it. This woman had lost everything yet maintained her dignity and calm. In her quiet way, she had shown more strength than he had in the months following Charlotte's death. And somehow, without intending to, she had brought him back to life when he'd been determined to merely exist. The realization was both uncomfortable and exhilarating. What did it mean for his memory of Charlotte, for his future? These questions followed him as they rode across the flood-ravaged landscape toward Silver Creek Ranch, where a new chapter was about to begin. Jackson's ranch hands and their families reacted to Fei-Yen's arrival with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They were accustomed to Chinese workers in town, but not to one living among them. Hank's wife, Martha, a practical woman in her 50s, took charge of the situation, showing Fei-Yen to a small room off the kitchen that had once belonged to a housekeeper. "You'll be comfortable here," Martha said, eyeing the basket of kittens with amusement. "Those little ones will keep the mice away once they're bigger." Jackson hovered uncertainly in the doorway, watching as Fei-Yen placed her few salvaged possessions: a wooden comb, a small box that had belonged to her husband, a book written in Chinese characters, on the simple dresser. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked. She turned to him with a small smile. "You have already done more than enough, Mr. Lawson. Thank you for your kindness." Martha glanced between them, her expression thoughtful. "I'll leave you to settle in," she said to Fei-Yen. "Supper's at 6. You're welcome to join us in the kitchen." Once Martha had gone, an awkward silence fell. This was different from their meetings at her cabin, more formal, more observed. The casual ease they'd developed seemed suddenly fragile. "The ranch is beautiful," Fei-Yen said finally, moving to the window which overlooked the main yard and corrals beyond. "Mrs. Lawson described it well." Jackson joined her at the window, careful to maintain a proper distance. "It was my father's vision. Took him 15 years to build it to this." "And you have continued his work." "Tried to." She glanced at him. "You have succeeded. This is a place of life and purpose." The simple observation struck him. He had been maintaining the ranch out of duty and habit, not seeing it as she did, as a living, growing entity that had prospered under his stewardship despite his grief. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," he said, "until you decide what comes next." She nodded, turning back to the window. "What comes next has always been uncertain for me. Perhaps that is the way of life on the frontier." The philosophical tone reminded him of their many conversations over the kittens. Those small creatures had brought them together, giving them a shared purpose when both were adrift in different ways. "I should let you rest," he said finally. "It's been a difficult day." As he turned to go, she spoke again, her voice softer. "Mr. Lawson, Jackson, thank you, not just for the shelter but for the milk for the visits. They meant more than you know." It was the first time she had used his given name. The sound of it in her accented voice created a warmth in his chest that both comforted and unsettled him. "They meant a great deal to me as well," he admitted. With that acknowledgement hanging between them, he left her to settle in, his mind whirling with possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider before now. The next few days established a new rhythm at Silver Creek. Fei-Yen quickly made herself useful, helping Martha with cooking and mending, treating a ranch hand's infected cut with herbs she gathered from the hills, and caring for the kittens who were now exploring their new home with increasing confidence. Jackson found reasons to be in the house more often, paperwork that needed attention, equipment that needed mending, discussions about supplies that could have been handled by Hank. Each time he would find his way to wherever Fei-Yen was working, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in the same space. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Whispers and speculative glances followed the pair, though never within Jackson's hearing. It had been only 4 months since Charlotte's death, too soon for most to consider it appropriate for him to show interest in another woman, especially a Chinese one. But there was no denying the change in their employer. The darkness that had surrounded him was lifting. He laughed again, made plans for the future, engaged with the daily life of the ranch in ways he had abandoned after his loss. As for Fei-Yen, she maintained a careful propriety, never speaking to Jackson alone except when others were nearby, keeping their conversations light and impersonal. Yet there were moments, a glance held too long, a smile that appeared only for him, a flush that rose to her cheeks when their hands accidentally touched, that suggested deeper feelings carefully contained. The situation came to a head when news arrived from town that Reverend Wilson was organizing accommodation for Fei-Yen, with a Chinese family who had recently established a laundry business. "It's very generous of them," Martha told Jackson as they stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Fei-Yen in the garden where she had begun establishing a new plot for herbs and vegetables. "She'll be with her own people, and there's work for her at the laundry." Jackson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. When is this supposed to happen? "Reverend's coming out tomorrow to discuss it with her. Thought you should know first, being as you've been so concerned for her welfare." Martha's tone held no judgment, but her eyes were knowing. After 20 years as the foreman's wife, little escaped her notice. Jackson nodded stiffly. "Thank you for telling me." That evening he found himself unable to concentrate on the ranch ledgers. The thought of Fei-Yen leaving, of returning to the emptiness that had been his life before her, was unbearable. Yet what right did he have to ask her to stay? What could he offer that would be better than the security of living among her own community? As darkness fell, he walked out to the porch, staring across the moonlit valley. The sight that had once filled him with pride now seemed hollow at the prospect of facing it alone again. Movement caught his eye, a small figure walking along the path that led to the hillside where Charlotte and their son were buried. Fei-Yen, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, a shawl wrapped against the evening chill. Without conscious decision, Jackson followed, maintaining a respectful distance. He watched as she climbed the gentle slope to stand before the 2 wooden crosses. To his surprise, she knelt and placed something at the base of Charlotte's marker, flowers, he realized, wildflowers gathered from the meadow. The gesture struck him deeply. This woman, who had lost her own husband, was honoring his wife with such simple reverence. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. As he drew near, he heard her speaking softly in Chinese, words he couldn't understand but whose cadence suggested a prayer or blessing. "Fei-Yen," he said gently when she had finished. She turned, clearly surprised to find him there. "Jackson, I'm sorry if I've intruded. I wanted to pay my respects." "It's not an intrusion." He moved to stand beside her, looking down at the flowers she had placed. "It's kind of you to remember her." "She was kind to me," Fei-Yen replied simply. "And she loved this land. I thought she would like to know it continues to bloom." They stood in silence for a moment, the vast Montana sky stretching above them, stars emerging in the deepening blue. "I heard about the arrangement in town," Jackson said finally, "with the Chinese family." Fei-Yen nodded. "The Reverend's wife wrote to me. It is a generous offer." "Will you take it?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It would be sensible. They are my people. The work is honest." "But," he prompted, sensing her hesitation. She turned to look at him directly. "But I have come to care for this place. And for the people here." The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite brave enough to make it explicit. "I don't want you to go," Jackson said finally, the words emerging rougher than he intended. "I know it's selfish. I know it hasn't been long since Charlotte, but when I thought you'd been taken by the flood, I realized something." He paused, gathering courage. This was more than he'd spoken of his feelings in years, perhaps ever. I realized that losing you would break something in me that was just starting to heal. You and those damn kittens somehow made me want to live again, not just exist. Fei-Yen's eyes widened, a flush rising to her cheeks. Jackson, I'm not asking anything of you, he hurried on. I just want you to know that there's a place for you here, a permanent one, however you want that to be. The implications of his offer hung in the night air. He was laying a path before her without presuming to know which direction she might choose to walk. People would talk, she said softly, echoing her words from weeks ago. A Chinese woman and a white rancher. It would not be easy. Let them talk, Jackson replied with sudden fierceness. This is my land, my life. I've spent too much of it worrying about what should be instead of what could be. Fei-Yen looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Then slowly she reached out and took his hand. I will think about it, she said. That is all I can promise now. It was enough, more than enough. The touch of her hand in his felt like the first real connection he'd made in months. Together they stood on the hillside, between past and future, as the Montana night deepened around them. The next morning brought Reverend Wilson to Silver Creek, his buggy kicking up dust along the ranch road. Jackson watched from the study window as the elderly clergyman was greeted by Martha and shown to the garden where Fei-Yen was working. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see their body language, the Reverend animated and earnest, Fei-Yen respectful but reserved. After about 15 minutes, they walked together toward the house, and Jackson quickly moved away from the window, not wanting to be caught observing. A knock at the study door preceded Martha's entrance. Reverend Wilson would like a word, if you're not too busy. Jackson nodded, straightening his vest. Send him in. The Reverend entered alone, his weathered face serious beneath a shock of white hair. At 70, Wilson had been one of the first permanent settlers in the territory and commanded respect even from those who rarely attended his services. Lawson, he said, extending a hand. Good to see you up and about. The Lord gives us trials, but also the strength to endure them. Jackson shook the offered hand, gesturing to a chair. What can I do for you, Reverend? Wilson settled himself, placing his hat on his knee. I've just been speaking with Mrs. Huang about her situation. I understand you've been generous enough to provide temporary shelter. It seemed the Christian thing to do, Jackson replied, borrowing the Reverend's language deliberately. Indeed, charity is a virtue commanded by our Lord. However, there are also matters of propriety to consider. And there it was, the real purpose of the visit. Jackson kept his expression neutral. Mrs. Huang has been a model of propriety, I assure you. She's well chaperoned by my foreman's wife and the other women on the ranch. Of course, Wilson said hurriedly. I cast no aspersions on the lady's character. She is well regarded among those who know her, but you must understand how such an arrangement might appear to those less charitable in their thinking. Jackson leaned back in his chair. I'm more concerned with doing what's right than with appearances, Reverend. The older man's eyes sharpened. Even when those appearances might affect your standing in the community, your business relationships, the legacy your father built. The question struck close to concerns Jackson himself had considered, but hearing them spoken aloud only strengthened his resolve. My father taught me that a man stands by his decisions, he said evenly. I've decided to offer Mrs. Huang a permanent place at Silver Creek, should she wish to accept it. Wilson's bushy eyebrows rose. A permanent place. In what capacity, may I ask? It was the question Jackson had been avoiding in his own mind. As employer, as friend, as something more, that will be for her to decide, he said finally. But whatever she chooses, she has a home here for as long as she wants it. The Reverend studied him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. You've changed since I saw you last, Lawson. There's something of your old spirit returned. Jackson hadn't expected this observation, perhaps. Mrs. Lawson, God rest her soul, would not have wanted you to live in darkness forever. The mention of Charlotte from this man who had presided over her funeral was both painful and oddly freeing. No, Jackson agreed quietly, she wouldn't have. Wilson nodded, rising to his feet. I'll inform the Huang family that Mrs. Huang has other arrangements then, but I caution you, young man, the path you're considering is not an easy one. There are laws in some places against such unions. Not in Montana Territory, Jackson replied, having researched this very point in recent days. Not in law, perhaps, but in custom and prejudice, the Reverend sighed. Just be certain of your heart before you proceed, for both your sakes. After Wilson departed, Jackson remained in his study, turning the conversation over in his mind. The Reverend had seen what Jackson himself had been reluctant to acknowledge, that his feelings for Fei-Yen went beyond friendship or charity. But was it too soon? Was he dishonoring Charlotte's memory by allowing his heart to turn toward another? Or would she, as Wilson suggested, have wanted him to find light again? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened to reveal Fei-Yen, her expression composed but her eyes turbulent. "May I speak with you?" she asked. Jackson stood immediately. "Of course, please sit down." She entered but remained standing, her hands clasped before her. "The Reverend has offered me a position with the Huang family in town. They are good people from my husband's province." "I see," Jackson's heart sank. "When would you go?" "That depends," she replied, "on whether there is reason for me to stay." The directness of her statement caught him off guard. In their many conversations, Fei-Yen had always been somewhat circumspect, approaching difficult topics obliquely. This forthright question suggested she had made some decision of her own. "I meant what I said last night," Jackson said carefully. "There's a place for you here, however you want that to be." She took a step closer, her dark eyes holding his. "And what do you want it to be, Jackson Lawson?" The question stripped away pretense. What did he want? He had been avoiding the answer, fearful of betraying Charlotte, fearful of opening himself to loss again, fearful of the complications a relationship with Fei-Yen would bring. But standing before her now, he found clarity. "I want you in my life," he said simply. "I know it's too soon, I know there will be difficulties, but when I'm with you, I remember what it's like to look forward to tomorrow." Fei-Yen's composure wavered, emotion flickering across her face. "In my culture, widows are expected to honor their husbands' memories for years, sometimes for life. To do otherwise is seen as disrespectful." "And is that what you believe?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I believe that Li would not want me to live in perpetual mourning, especially in a land where survival requires companionship. And I believe that honoring his memory means living fully, not merely existing." The echo of his own thoughts about Charlotte was striking. Perhaps grief in its essence was universal across cultures. "Then stay," Jackson said, taking a step toward her, "not as an employee or a charity case. Stay because we both have a chance to build something new here." Fei-Yen searched his face, looking for something, certainty perhaps, or the absence of doubt. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. "I will stay," she said finally, "but we must proceed with care. For both our sakes." Relief washed through him. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was something more valuable, a commitment to exploring the possibility of a future together, step by careful step. "Agreed," he said, "we'll find our way together." And for the first time since he'd stood over Charlotte's grave, Jackson Lawson felt hope take root in the soil of his heart. Word traveled quickly in the territory. Within days of Reverend Wilson's visit, rumors began circulating about the Silver Creek rancher and his Chinese guest. Some were sympathetic, the young widower finding comfort after tragedy. Others were less charitable, suggesting improper arrangements or questioning Jackson's judgment in business matters. The impact became tangible when Harlan Schmidt, a cattle buyer who had dealt with Silver Creek for years, arrived for the seasonal purchase and pointedly asked to speak with Jackson alone. "Heard some talk in town," Schmidt said without preamble once they were seated in the study, "about your domestic situation." Jackson kept his expression neutral. "My domestic situation is my own business, Harlan." The older man shifted uncomfortably. Ordinarily, I'd agree. But some of my buyers back east are particular about who they do business with, traditional values and all that. Are you saying they'd refuse Silver Creek beef because of who lives under my roof? Schmidt wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm saying it might be simpler for everyone if certain arrangements were more conventional. A cold anger settled in Jackson's chest. These were the consequences the Reverend had warned about: his father's legacy, his business relationships, all potentially compromised because of his personal choices. My cattle are the same quality they've always been, he said evenly. If your buyers are more concerned with my household than with the product I'm selling, perhaps we should reconsider our arrangement. It was a risky stance. Schmidt's purchases represented nearly a third of Silver Creek's annual income, but something in Jackson rebelled at the thought of being dictated to about his private life. The buyer seemed taken aback by his firmness. Now, I'm not saying I won't buy, just passing along concerns. Consider them passed along, Jackson replied coolly. Now, shall we discuss prices for this season's herd, or would you prefer to take your business elsewhere? In the end, Schmidt agreed to the usual arrangement, though at a slightly lower price than previous years. As he departed, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, Lawson, I've known you since you were a boy. Your father would have stood his ground too. Just be prepared, not everyone will be as willing to separate business from personal matters. After he'd gone, Jackson remained at his desk, contemplating the implications. How many other business relationships might be affected? How would this impact the ranch hands and their families, whose livelihoods depended on Silver Creek's success? Fei-Yen found him there an hour later, still lost in thought. She entered quietly, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. You look troubled, she observed. Jackson glanced up, his expression softening at the sight of her. In the weeks since the flood, she had become more confident in her place at the ranch, her movements more assured, her interactions with the staff more natural. Schmidt mentioned there's talk in town, he said, about you being here. Understanding dawned in her eyes, and it affects your business. He still bought the cattle, at a lower price, but he bought them. She nodded slowly, sitting in the chair opposite his desk. This is only the beginning. There will be more consequences if, she paused, choosing her words carefully, if our friendship continues to deepen. The delicate phrasing made him smile despite his concerns. Is that what we're calling it? Friendship. A flush colored her cheeks. What would you call it? It was a fair question. They had shared meals, conversations, walks along the creek. Their hands had touched briefly and seemingly accidentally, with increasing frequency. But there had been no declarations, no clear crossing of the line from friendship to courtship. I'd call it the most important thing in my life right now, he said simply. Fei-Yen's expression softened, but concern remained in her eyes. Important enough to risk your father's legacy, the prosperity of this ranch, the goodwill of your neighbors. These were the questions he'd been wrestling with himself. In the abstract, it was easy to declare that love, or whatever was growing between them, should transcend social prejudice. In reality, the consequences would affect not just him but everyone connected to Silver Creek. I don't have an answer yet, he admitted, but I know that sending you away would be the wrong one. She reached across the desk, briefly touching his hand. Then we will find the right answers together, day by day. Her calm practicality steadied him. This woman had already navigated far greater challenges than social disapproval, crossing an ocean to a strange land, losing her husband, building a life alone in a community that barely tolerated her presence. If she could face those trials with such grace, surely they could weather whatever came next. Day by day, he agreed, turning his hand to briefly clasp hers. The summer advanced, bringing with it the intense activity of the ranching season. Cattle needed moving to higher pastures, fences required repair after the spring floods, and preparations for the fall roundup occupied everyone at Silver Creek. Amidst this work, Jackson and Fei-Yen's relationship continued to evolve, finding its own rhythm within the daily life of the ranch. She had taken over a corner of the kitchen garden, establishing beds of both familiar Western vegetables and Chinese herbs and greens that fascinated Martha and the other ranch wives. The kittens, now half-grown, had become fixtures around the property, with the gray runt, now named Warrior by Jackson, often following him on his rounds. Their evenings often found them on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence as the sunset painted the valley in gold and crimson. These moments of quiet companionship filled a void in Jackson that he hadn't fully acknowledged before, not just the absence left by Charlotte's death, but a deeper loneliness that had been part of him since his parents' passing. It was during one such evening, as September's first chill crept into the air, that Jackson finally put words to what had been growing between them. "I never expected to feel this way again," he said, watching as the last light faded from the distant peaks. "After Charlotte died, I thought that part of me was finished." Fei-Yen turned to look at him, her profile gilded by the last rays of sun. "What way?" "Hopeful," he said after a moment's consideration, looking forward instead of back. "Seeing possibilities instead of just getting through each day." She nodded slowly. "In my village there is a saying, the heart is like a garden that can bloom again after the harshest winter." "Is that how you feel?" "After Lee." She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "When Lee died, I thought my life was over, not just because I loved him, but because I was alone in a foreign land, without family or protection. Survival became my only goal." She paused, looking out across the darkening valley. "But survival is not living. These past months here with you, I have remembered what it means to truly live." The simple honesty of her words touched something deep within him. Without conscious thought, Jackson reached over and took her hand, twining his fingers with hers. "I love you," he said quietly. "I think I have for some time now." The words hung in the evening air, irrevocable. Fei-Yen's fingers tightened around his, but she didn't immediately respond. In the growing darkness, he couldn't read her expression. "You don't have to say anything," he continued. "I just wanted you to know." Finally, she turned to face him fully. "In China, such words are rarely spoken directly. Feelings are shown through actions, through care and respect." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But we are not in China, and I have come to value the directness of this country." She took a breath, then continued with quiet certainty. "I love you too, Jackson Lawson, though I feared to admit it even to myself." The simple declaration filled him with a joy he had thought never to feel again. Without words, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers, their first deliberate, unmistakable gesture of affection. "Whatever comes," he said, "we'll face it together." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. Together. In that moment, on the porch of the home his father had built, Jackson felt a sense of rightness that transcended all the complications and potential hardships. This woman who had endured so much, who saw him clearly and loved him anyway, was where his future lay. The question was how to build that future in a world that might not readily accept it. The opportunity to answer that question came sooner than expected. 3 days after their declaration on the porch, a letter arrived from the territorial governor's office, announcing an upcoming visit to the region. Governor Hosser would be touring significant ranching operations as part of an assessment of the territory's economic development, and Silver Creek had been selected as one of his stops. "It's an honor," Hank said as they discussed the news over breakfast. "The governor doesn't visit just anywhere. Means Silver Creek is being recognized as important to the territory's future." Jackson nodded, though his thoughts were racing ahead to the implications. The governor's visit would bring additional scrutiny to the ranch and to his personal arrangements. How would Hosser react to Fei-Yen's presence? Would it affect how Silver Creek was represented in his report to Washington? "When is he coming?" he asked. "Week from Tuesday," Hank replied. "We should have the North Pasture herd brought in by then, show him our best stock." "Agreed, and we'll need to prepare the house." "Martha, can you handle that?" The foreman's wife nodded. "We'll have everything spotless. Should prepare a proper dinner too, I expect." "Whatever you think appropriate," Jackson said. "Just let me know what you need." As the conversation turned to logistical details, he caught Fei-Yen's eye across the table. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he could read the question there. What role would she play in this official visit? Later, when they had a moment alone in the garden, he addressed her unspoken concern. "I want you by my side when the governor visits," he said without preamble. As the lady of Silver Creek. Fei-Yen looked up from the herbs she was gathering, surprise evident on her face. "Jackson, are you certain that's wise? The governor represents the territory's interests." "If he disapproves." "Then he disapproves," Jackson finished firmly. "I'm done hiding what you mean to me. If Silver Creek is important enough to be showcased to the governor, then its future is tied to you as much as to me." She studied his face, searching for doubt or uncertainty. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Then I will stand with you, but we should be prepared for consequences." "Always," he agreed, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was witnessed by one of the ranch hands passing nearby, who quickly looked away but not before Jackson saw the flash of discomfort in his expression. Such small reactions had become commonplace as the nature of his relationship with Fei-Yen became increasingly evident. Most of the Silver Creek staff had adjusted to the situation with pragmatic acceptance. A few, particularly those whose families had been with the ranch for years, showed genuine happiness at seeing their employer finding joy again. But there were others, newer hands, those with strong religious convictions or racial prejudices, who made their disapproval known through small acts of disrespect or avoidance. So far, none had openly challenged him or been disrespectful enough to warrant dismissal. But the tension was there, an undercurrent beneath the daily operations of the ranch. The governor's visit would force the issue into the open, requiring everyone at Silver Creek to publicly acknowledge or reject the relationship between the owner and the Chinese woman who had become central to the household. It was a risk, Jackson knew, but continuing to treat their love as something to be hidden or ashamed of was a greater one to his own integrity and to Fei-Yen's dignity. The day of Governor Hosser's visit dawned clear and crisp, with the first hint of autumn coloring the distant hills. The entire ranch had been prepared, buildings freshly painted, yards swept, cattle groomed, hands in their cleanest clothes. Martha had outdone herself in the kitchen, preparing a meal that would showcase the best of Montana's bounty. Jackson stood on the porch in his finest suit, watching as a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the approaching party. Beside him, Fei-Yen waited quietly, dressed in a blue silk dress that blended Chinese and Western styles, her black hair arranged simply but elegantly. "You look beautiful," he said, glancing down at her. She smiled, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "And you look every inch the successful rancher. Your father would be proud." The mention of his father steadied him. Daniel Lawson had been a man of principle, willing to stand against convention when he believed he was right. It was that same resolve that Jackson now drew upon as the governor's carriage and accompanying riders came into view. Governor Samuel Hosser was a businessman first, politician second, a silver magnate who had been appointed to the territorial governorship the previous year. He was known for his practical approach to development and his relatively progressive views on expansion. With him rode several aides and what appeared to be Eastern businessmen, likely potential investors in territorial enterprises. Jackson stepped forward as the carriage halted, extending his hand as the governor descended. "Governor Hosser, welcome to Silver Creek." Hosser, a robust man in his 50s with a thick mustache, clasped his hand firmly. "Lawson. Good to finally meet you. Your reputation precedes you, youngest major rancher in the territory, I understand." "Since my father's passing, yes, sir." The governor nodded sympathetically, then his gaze shifted to Fei-Yen, who had stepped forward to stand at Jackson's side. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly masked by political composure. "And this is?" he inquired politely. Jackson placed his hand lightly on the small of Fei-Yen's back, the gesture deliberate and unmistakable. "Governor Hosser, may I present Mrs. Fei-Yen Huang. Mrs. Huang, Governor Samuel Hosser of Montana Territory." Fei-Yen offered a perfect curtsy, neither too deep nor too casual. "It is an honor to meet you, Governor." Hosser hesitated only momentarily before inclining his head. "Mrs. Huang, a pleasure. He turned to introduce his companions, two railroad investors from New York, his personal secretary, and the territorial marshal who had accompanied them for security. The initial introductions complete, Jackson led the party on a tour of the ranch operations. He was in his element here, knowledgeable and confident as he explained Silver Creek's breeding program, grazing rotation system, and water management practices. Throughout the tour, he kept Fei-Yen at his side, subtly including her in the conversation, acknowledging her contributions to the ranch's gardens and her knowledge of herbal remedies that had benefited their livestock. She spoke when addressed but otherwise maintained a dignified presence that even the Eastern investors seemed to respect, if not fully understand. It was during the dinner, however, that the true test came. Seated at the head of the table with Hauser to his right and Fei-Yen to his left, Jackson could feel the scrutiny of the visitors as they observed the dynamic between himself and the Chinese woman he had so prominently positioned as his hostess. The conversation had turned to the territory's development when one of the New Yorkers, a banker named Phillips, addressed Fei-Yen directly. "Mrs. Huang, I understand the Chinese community has been instrumental in the railroad's construction. Do you have family involved in that enterprise?" It was a seemingly innocent question, but Jackson detected the underlying assumption that she must be connected to labor rather than to Silver Creek itself. Fei-Yen answered with perfect composure. "My late husband worked on the Central Pacific, sir. He was a foreman for a blasting crew. I came to Montana after his passing and found a new home here at Silver Creek." The banker nodded, though his expression suggested he hadn't received the clarification he sought. "And your position here is?" Before Fei-Yen could respond, Jackson intervened. "Mrs. Huang is my partner in overseeing Silver Creek, Mr. Phillips. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs has reduced our livestock losses by nearly 15% this year, and her garden has made us largely self-sufficient in vegetables." The term partner hung in the air, its ambiguity both deliberate and challenging. It could be interpreted as a business arrangement or as something more personal. Jackson was content to let his guests draw their own conclusions. Governor Hauser, more politically astute than his companions, smoothly redirected the conversation. "Speaking of self-sufficiency, Lawson, I'm interested in your water management system. With the territory's unpredictable rainfall, that's knowledge worth sharing with other operations." The dinner proceeded without further direct challenges, though Jackson was acutely aware of the undercurrents. The Eastern investors exchanged occasional glances when Fei-Yen spoke. The territorial marshal maintained a carefully neutral expression, and Governor Hauser observed everything with the calculating eye of a man who had built his fortune on assessing both material resources and human character. After the meal, as coffee was served in the study, Hauser maneuvered to speak with Jackson privately, while the others examined his father's collection of geological specimens from around the territory. "You've built something impressive here, Lawson," the governor said quietly. "Continuing your father's legacy while adding innovations of your own, the territory needs operations like Silver Creek." "Thank you, sir," Jackson replied, sensing there was more to come. Hauser glanced toward Fei-Yen, who was explaining a jade carving to one of the investors. "Your arrangement is unconventional." It wasn't a question, but Jackson answered as if it were. "Yes, sir, it is. You understand it may create complications. For Silver Creek's standing, for potential contracts with the Army, for relationships with certain banks and investors. I'm aware of the possibilities." The governor studied him thoughtfully. "Yet you've chosen to make it public, to present Mrs. Huang as the lady of your home to official visitors, no less." Jackson met his gaze directly. "I believe a man should stand by his choices, Governor. My father taught me that much." "Indeed," Hauser sipped his coffee. "You know, there are increasing pressures from certain quarters for legislation against Chinese immigrants. Some territories are considering laws restricting property ownership, business licenses, even marriage." The implication was clear. Jackson felt a cold anger rising but controlled it. "And where do you stand on such matters, Governor?" Hauser's mustache twitched slightly. Officially, I must consider all perspectives within the territory. Personally, he paused, lowering his voice further. I believe a territory built on forcing good men to choose between prosperity and personal happiness is unlikely to thrive in the long term. It wasn't an endorsement, exactly. But it wasn't condemnation either. Jackson nodded, understanding the delicate position the political appointee occupied. The railroad investors with me today, Hauser continued, are more concerned with profits than with social conventions. They've seen the value of your operation. I suspect they'll be interested in discussing cattle contracts for their dining cars, regardless of your domestic arrangements. Relief and gratitude washed through Jackson. I appreciate your candor, Governor. Just be prepared, Hauser warned. Not everyone will be so pragmatic. There will be challenges ahead, some potentially serious. We'll face them as they come, Jackson replied with quiet confidence. The governor raised an eyebrow at the "we," but nodded in acknowledgement. For what it's worth, Mrs. Huang conducts herself with remarkable grace. She's a credit to your home. With that, he rejoined the main group, leaving Jackson to consider both the warning and the subtle approval it contained. Later that night, after the governor's party had departed for town with promises of future business discussions, Jackson and Fei-Yen stood once more on the porch. The ranch was quiet, the autumn stars brilliant overhead. You were magnificent today, Jackson said, drawing her into the circle of his arms for the first time without concern for who might see. Every inch a rancher's wife. Fei-Yen leaned into his embrace, her cheek resting against his chest. Not yet a wife, she reminded him softly. The gentle correction made his heart race. They had not discussed marriage explicitly, though their declarations of love and increasing openness about their relationship had been moving in that direction. Would you want to be? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. My wife, I mean. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her dark eyes serious in the moonlight. Is that a proposal, Jackson Lawson? He smiled, cupping her face in his hands. Not yet. When I propose, it will be done properly. But I wanted to know if it's something you might consider, given the complications. Fei-Yen was quiet for a moment, considering. In China, marriages are arranged by families based on compatibility and practical considerations. Love is expected to grow over time, not precede the union. She placed her hand over his where it rested on her cheek. But we are not in China, and I have already loved and lost one husband. If I were to marry again, it would only be for the deepest love. Her words filled him with hope. And do you feel that for me? You know I do, she said simply, but there are realities we must consider. Children of such a marriage would face prejudice. Your standing in the community would be affected. Some might refuse to do business with Silver Creek. These were all concerns Jackson had already weighed in his mind. The governor believes the territory is changing. Development, the railroad, new settlers, they're bringing different perspectives. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but change comes slowly. Are you prepared for what might come before it does? In her question, Jackson heard not doubt but a need for certainty, that he had truly considered the path they were contemplating, with all its potential hardships. I've already lost the people I loved most, my parents, Charlotte, our son, he said gravely. The worst has already happened to me, and I survived. The only thing I'm not prepared for is losing you or living a half-life because I was too afraid to reach for happiness. Fei-Yen's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then when you ask properly, I will answer properly, she whispered, but know that my heart has already decided. Jackson lowered his head and kissed her for the first time, gently at first, then with growing certainty as her arms wound around his neck. In that kiss was a promise of the future they would build together, whatever challenges it might hold. Above them, the Montana stars bore witness to a love that defied convention, born from tragedy but reaching toward hope on the frontier that had claimed so much from them both. The next morning, Jackson rode into town with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The visit from Governor Hauser had crystallized something in his mind. If he was going to build a future with Fei-Yen, it needed to be done properly, openly, and with all the legal protections he could secure for her and any children they might have. His first stop was at the office of Harold Jennings, the territory's most respected attorney, and a man who had advised Jackson's father on numerous matters over the years. "Marriage license," Jennings repeated after Jackson had explained his intention. The older man removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "Between yourself and Mrs. Huang, the Chinese lady." "That's correct," Jackson confirmed, his posture straight and unyielding. "I understand there may be legal complexities." Jennings replaced his glasses, studying Jackson with a mixture of concern and resignation. "Montana Territory currently has no laws explicitly prohibiting marriages between whites and Chinese, unlike some states and territories. However," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "there are efforts underway in the territorial legislature to enact such restrictions, following the example of California and other western regions. But currently it's legal." "Currently, yes. Though I would be remiss not to advise you of the potential social and economic implications." "I'm well aware of those," Jackson interrupted. "What I need to know is how to ensure that any such marriage is legally binding and provides full protection for Mrs. Huang's rights to property and inheritance." Jennings leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional concern to something like admiration. "You're serious about this?" "Completely." The attorney nodded slowly. "Then I suggest we prepare comprehensive documentation. A marriage contract specifying property rights, a properly updated will, land deeds clearly establishing Mrs. Huang's entitlements in the event of your death or incapacitation." "How quickly can you prepare these documents?" "Give me a week. I want to research the latest territorial statutes thoroughly. If the law changes after your marriage, it's unlikely to be applied retroactively, but I want every protection in place." Jackson nodded, relief washing through him. "Thank you, Harold. I appreciate your discretion as well as your expertise." Jennings smiled thinly. "I've known you since you were in short pants, Jackson. Your father was a man who made his own decisions, consequences be damned. I see you've inherited that quality." "Among others, I hope," Jackson replied, thinking of his father's fairness and integrity. As he left the attorney's office, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The practical aspects of his decision were being addressed. Now for the personal ones. His next stop was at Miller's Jewelry and Watchmaking, where he spent nearly an hour selecting a ring. The final choice was a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond, elegant without ostentation, much like Fei-Yen herself. The jeweler wrapped it carefully, his expression neutral but his movements hurried, as if eager to complete the transaction without discussion. Jackson noticed but chose not to comment. Such reactions would be part of their life together. They would face far worse than a shopkeeper's discomfort. As he emerged onto the main street, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Reverend Wilson approaching, his expression concerned. "Lawson, a word if you please." Jackson nodded politely, though inwardly he braced himself. "Reverend, what can I do for you?" Wilson glanced at the package from the jeweler's, then met Jackson's eyes directly. "I've heard rumors that you're planning to marry Mrs. Huang." News traveled quickly in a small town. Jackson wondered who had spoken, the attorney's clerk perhaps, or someone who had observed his visit to the jeweler. "Word does get around," he acknowledged without confirming or denying. The elderly clergyman sighed. "I had hoped the governor's visit might have shown you the precariousness of your position. Such a union would be difficult to accept for many in this community." "Including yourself?" Jackson asked quietly. Wilson hesitated. "I believe in God's love for all his children, regardless of origin. But I also believe in the practical realities of the world he created. Mixed marriages face hardships that few withstand." "We've both already endured the worst the frontier can deliver," Jackson replied. "We're prepared for whatever comes next." The Reverend studied him, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Would you expect me to perform such a ceremony as the community's spiritual leader?" It was a question Jackson had considered. Having Wilson officiate would lend a degree of legitimacy to their union in the eyes of the territory, but he wouldn't ask the man to compromise his convictions. Only if you could do so in good conscience, he answered honestly. We'll find another way if necessary. Something like respect flickered in Wilson's eyes. You've changed, Lawson. There's a steadiness to you now that was missing after Mrs. Lawson's passing. I cannot say I approve of your choice, but I recognize the man of principle making it. He extended his hand, which Jackson took with some surprise. Should you proceed with this plan, the Reverend continued, and should you wish me to officiate, I will consider it prayerfully. That is all I can promise. That's more than I expected, Jackson admitted. Thank you. As Wilson departed, Jackson realized that the conversation represented the pattern their life would likely follow: some rejection, some conditional acceptance, and the occasional surprising ally. It would never be easy, but nothing worthwhile on the frontier ever was. With the ring secure in his pocket and the legal preparations underway, Jackson rode back to Silver Creek, his mind turning to the question of how and when to properly propose. He wanted the moment to be perfect, to honor both the Western traditions Fei-Yen had come to respect and the Chinese customs that were her heritage. Upon returning to the ranch, he found Hank waiting for him with news that temporarily pushed personal matters aside. A telegram had arrived warning of an early snowstorm moving toward the territory. The cattle in the high pastures needed to be brought down immediately if they were to avoid losses. I'll gather the men, Jackson decided after reviewing the weather report. We'll head out at first light tomorrow. It'll be a hard ride, Hank warned. 3, maybe 4 days if the weather turns before we reach them. Jackson nodded grimly. Can't be helped, I won't lose those cattle. That evening, as he packed supplies for the journey, Fei-Yen found him in the tack room. Hank told me about the storm, she said, leaning against the doorframe. You're leaving in the morning. Have to, he replied, checking the leather straps on his saddlebags. Those cattle represent a significant investment, and the hands depend on their share of the profits. She nodded, watching him work. I will have food prepared before dawn, and extra bandages for the medical kit. Her practical support warmed him. This woman understood the realities of ranch life, the unpredictable demands, the financial necessities, the responsibilities to the men who worked the land. I had planned, he began, then shook his head. It will have to wait until I return. Fei-Yen studied him, her head tilted slightly. What will have to wait? Jackson hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the small package from the jeweler. This. Her eyes widened as she realized what it must contain. Jackson. I'm not asking now, he said quickly. It wouldn't be right rushing off afterward. When I propose properly, I want time to celebrate together. He returned the package to his pocket. But I wanted you to know my intentions are serious. I've spoken with Jennings about the legal arrangements. Fei-Yen's expression softened. And I wanted you to know that my answer is already formed in my heart, she replied quietly. It will wait for your return, however long that takes. In that moment, standing in the dusty tack room surrounded by saddles and bridles, Jackson felt a certainty about their future that transcended all the external complications. This woman who had faced loss and hardship with such dignity, who had rebuilt her life in a foreign land, who had seen past his grief to the man beneath, she was his true north, the direction his life would follow from this point forward. I'll come back to you, he promised, crossing the room to take her hands in his. Always. She squeezed his hands, her eyes holding his. I will be waiting, always. The cattle drive began at dawn the next morning, 20 men riding out from Silver Creek toward the high country where the summer herd grazed. Jackson took the lead, setting a brisk pace despite the challenging terrain. Time was of the essence if they were to reach the cattle before the storm struck. For 2 days they pushed hard, making better progress than Hank had predicted. The sky remained clear, though the sharp drop in temperature and the restlessness of wildlife suggested the approaching weather system was real enough. On the third morning, they reached the high meadow where the cattle had been pastured since June. The herd looked healthy, the summer grazing had fattened them nicely, their coats glossy in the autumn sunlight. "We got here in time," Hank observed as they surveyed the cattle from a ridge. "Now comes the hard part, getting them down before that hits." He nodded toward the northern horizon, where dark clouds were building, still distant but clearly moving their way. Jackson studied the gathering storm, calculating distances and timing. "If we start now, work through until dark and get an early start tomorrow, we might make the lower valley before it hits." "Pushing them that hard risks injuries," Hank warned. "Especially on the steeper sections." "Leaving them up here risks worse," Jackson countered. "I've seen what an early blizzard can do to cattle caught in the open." The foreman nodded grimly. They had both witnessed the aftermath of such storms, cattle dead in snowdrifts, the survivors so weakened they rarely made it through the winter. "We'll do it your way," Hank conceded. "I'll organize the men." The work began immediately, gathering the scattered herd and establishing the drive order. The cattle were reluctant to leave the rich meadow, requiring more effort than usual to start them moving. By mid-afternoon, however, they had established a steady pace along the trail that wound down from the high country. Progress was slower than Jackson had hoped. Twice they had to stop to extract cattle that had wandered into difficult terrain. A young hand was thrown when his horse stumbled, resulting in a minor injury that further delayed them. By the time darkness forced them to make camp, they had covered less than half the distance to the lower valley. That night the temperature plummeted. The men huddled around campfires, drinking coffee laced with whiskey to ward off the bone-deep chill. Jackson made rounds, checking on the cattle and the hands, ensuring everyone had sufficient blankets and warm food. As he stood at the edge of the camp, looking toward the north where the storm clouds now obscured the stars, Jackson found himself thinking of Fei-Yen. Was she watching the same sky from Silver Creek, worrying about the approaching storm? About him, the thought of her waiting for his return strengthened his resolve. They would get these cattle down safely, and then he would ask her to be his wife. The frontier had taken enough from both of them. It was time to build something lasting together. Morning brought confirmation of their worst fears. The storm had accelerated overnight, the leading edge of clouds now directly overhead, heavy with the promise of snow. The temperature had dropped further and the cattle were restless, sensing the changing weather. "We need to move fast," Jackson instructed the hands as they mounted up. "Keep them tight, keep them moving, no stragglers." The drive resumed with renewed urgency. They pushed harder than was strictly safe, accepting the risk of injuries to avoid the greater danger of being caught in the open when the storm hit. The cattle, perhaps sensing the humans' anxiety, were more cooperative than the previous day, moving steadily down the increasingly steep trail. By mid-morning, the first snow began to fall, light flurries at first, beautiful but ominous. Within an hour it had intensified, reducing visibility and making the trail treacherous. Jackson rode the length of the herd repeatedly, encouraging the hands, checking for problems, keeping the momentum. They were making good progress despite the deteriorating conditions when disaster struck. A flash of lightning, unusual in a snowstorm, startled a group of steers near the front of the herd. The animals bolted, veering off the trail toward a steep ravine. The sudden movement triggered a chain reaction, with more cattle following the leaders in a growing wave of panic. "Head them off," Jackson shouted, spurring his horse toward the breaking point. Several hands followed, riding hard to intercept the stampeding cattle before they reached the ravine edge. What happened next occurred in seconds but would replay in slow motion in Jackson's memory for years to come. His horse, sure-footed until then, hit a patch of snow-covered stone and slipped. As the animal struggled to regain its footing, a steer crashed into its flank, sending both horse and rider tumbling. Jackson felt himself falling, heard shouts from the other riders, then a sickening impact as he struck the ground. Pain exploded through his left leg and side. He tried to roll away from the oncoming cattle, but his body wouldn't respond properly. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the dark sky above, snow falling like stars against the gathering storm. Awareness returned in fragments, voices, movement, pain that flared with each jolt. Jackson opened his eyes to find himself being transported on a makeshift stretcher, two riders carefully leading horses that dragged the contraption across the snowy ground. "He's awake," someone called, and Hank's weathered face appeared above him. "Don't try to move," the foreman instructed. "Legs broken bad, maybe ribs too. We're getting you down to where the doc can reach you." Jackson tried to speak, found his mouth too dry. Hank held a canteen to his lips, allowing him a small sip. "The cattle," Jackson managed. A shadow crossed Hank's face. "Lost 12 over the ravine edge, got the rest under control. The boys are bringing them down now." 12 cattle, a significant financial loss, but not catastrophic. The pain in his leg suggested his own situation might be more serious. "How bad?" he asked, gesturing weakly toward his injury. Hank's expression was grave. "Compound fracture. We've splinted it best we could, but you need a doctor." Barnes rode ahead to Silver Creek. "With luck, they'll have someone waiting when we reach the lower valley." Jackson nodded, then winced as pain shot through his head. Possible concussion too, then. He tried to focus on practical matters, to push away the fear that crept at the edges of his consciousness. "How long?" "Till we reach help, day and a half, maybe more with the storm. We're moving as fast as we can without jostling you too much." A day and a half of this pain, this helplessness. And that was before whatever the doctor might need to do. Jackson closed his eyes, breathing through a wave of nausea. "Try to rest," Hank advised. "Nothing you can do now but endure." Endure, it was the watchword of frontier life. Jackson had endured loss, loneliness, the harsh realities of carving a ranch from wilderness. He would endure this too, drawing strength from the knowledge that Fei-Yen waited at Silver Creek, Fei-Yen, who had survived her own trials with such grace. The journey down from the high country was a blur of pain, cold, and brief moments of lucidity. The storm intensified, slowing their progress to a crawl. Twice they had to stop completely, setting up crude shelters to wait out the worst of the blizzard. The men took turns staying with Jackson, melting snow for him to drink, trying to keep him warm as fever set in. By the time they reached the lower valley, nearly 3 days had passed since the accident. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, the infection in his leg sending poison through his blood, his body burning with fever despite the freezing temperatures. He was only vaguely aware of being transferred to a wagon, of voices he didn't recognize discussing amputation, of someone forcing bitter-tasting liquid between his lips. The pain receded somewhat after that, allowing darkness to claim him more completely. When next he woke, the quality of the light was different, softer, filtered through curtains he recognized as those in his own bedroom at Silver Creek. For a moment he wondered if the entire cattle drive had been a fever dream. Then he tried to move and gasped as pain lanced through his leg. "Lie still," came a gentle voice from beside the bed. "The doctor says you must not disturb the setting." Fei-Yen, he turned his head slowly to find her sitting in a chair pulled close to the bedside, her face drawn with fatigue but her eyes bright with relief. "How long?" he rasped, his throat parched. She reached for a glass of water, supporting his head as he drank. 5 days since they brought you home. The doctor has visited twice. You have been very ill." 5 days lost to fever and pain. Jackson tried to process this, but his mind felt sluggish, his thoughts disconnected. "My leg." Fei-Yen's expression tightened momentarily. "It was badly broken. The doctor wanted to amputate, but I refused to permit it while you were unconscious. He agreed to try setting it instead, though he is not confident of full recovery." The implications settled slowly through the haze of whatever medication they had given him. He might never walk properly again, might never ride or work cattle or run across the fields of Silver Creek. "You saved my leg," he said finally. She shook her head slightly. "I insisted they try. The doctor did the work. And now you must do yours, healing, rebuilding strength." Even through his fog, Jackson recognized the steel beneath her gentle tone. This woman had fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself, had made decisions that others might have considered beyond her right or authority. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching for her hand. She took it, her fingers warm against his. I could not let them take part of you without your consent, she said simply. Not when there was hope. In that moment, despite the pain and uncertainty, Jackson felt a profound gratitude for whatever twist of fate had brought this extraordinary woman into his life. She had preserved not just his limb but his future, his autonomy, his chance to walk beside her rather than depend on her completely. "The kittens?" he asked, needing a moment of normalcy amid the medical concerns. A small smile touched her lips. "Growing fat and causing trouble. The gray one, Warrior, sleeps on your pillow each night until I chase him away." The domestic image comforted him. Life had continued at Silver Creek during his absence and illness. The world hadn't ended because one man was temporarily laid low. The herd. Safe in the lower pastures. "Hank has managed everything." She hesitated, then added, "There has been much concern for you. The hands ask daily for news of your condition." Jackson nodded, feeling weariness creeping back over him. The brief conversation had drained what little strength he had. Fei-Yen noticed immediately. "You should rest now. I will be here when you wake." As his eyes drifted closed, he felt her lips brush his forehead, a tender gesture that followed him into healing sleep. Recovery was a slow and painful process. The doctor, a gruff man named Matthews who served the entire county, had done his best with the shattered leg, but he remained skeptical about Jackson's chances for full mobility. "The bones were badly splintered," he explained during a visit 2 weeks after the accident. "I've set them as well as possible, but there's likely to be permanent shortening and weakness. You may need a cane for the rest of your life." Jackson absorbed this news stoically. "But I'll walk." "With effort and time, yes. Riding may be possible eventually, though not the kind of hard riding required for cattle work." It was both better and worse than he'd feared. Not an invalid then, but not the physically capable rancher he'd been either. The implications for Silver Creek's operations were significant. After the doctor departed, Jackson sat propped in his bed, staring out the window at the ranch yard where life continued without him. Hank was directing hands in preparing equipment for winter storage. Martha was hanging laundry on the line, taking advantage of a rare sunny day in the late autumn. The scene was so normal, yet he felt removed from it, separated not just by the glass but by his injury. A soft knock at the door preceded Fei-Yen's entrance, carrying a tray with tea and what smelled like freshly baked bread. She had taken to bringing him meals personally rather than allowing Martha or one of the other women to attend him. "You look troubled," she observed, setting the tray on the bedside table. Jackson sighed. "Matthews says I'll never ride properly again, may need a cane permanently." Fei-Yen nodded, accepting the news without visible distress. "Many men have built good lives with such limitations." "Not ranching lives," he replied, frustration edging his voice. "A rancher needs to ride to work cattle to cover long distances across rough country." She poured tea for them both before responding. "Perhaps the ranch must adapt then. Your father built this place with his vision, now you must reshape it with yours." The simple wisdom of her statement caught him off guard. He had been thinking only of what he could no longer do, not of how Silver Creek might evolve to accommodate his new reality. "What do you mean?" Fei-Yen handed him a cup, her expression thoughtful. "Silver Creek's strength is not only in its cattle, but in its land, its water, its position. Perhaps there are other enterprises that could complement the ranching, crops that require less physical labor to oversee, breeding programs that focus on quality rather than quantity and require less riding, investments in the businesses that support the territory's growth." Her strategic thinking impressed him. These were not the observations of someone who saw the ranch as merely a home, but as a complex enterprise with multiple possibilities. "You've given this serious thought," he said, studying her with new appreciation. A small smile touched her lips. "I have had much time to consider it while watching over you these past weeks." Jackson took her hand, drawing her to sit on the edge of the bed. "I've been selfish, thinking only of how this injury affects me. You've been caring for me, managing the household, dealing with everyone's concerns, and still finding time to think about Silver Creek's future." She shook her head slightly. It is not selfishness to mourn what you have lost. But perhaps it is time now to look toward what can be gained. Starting with making you my wife, Jackson said firmly. I've waited too long already. Fei-Yen's eyes widened. Jackson, you are still recovering. There is no rush. There's every rush, he countered. Life is uncertain. I've just had that lesson reinforced rather dramatically. I don't want to waste another day. Her expression softened. Is this truly how you wish to propose? From a sickbed with no ceremony. Jackson grimaced, recognizing the truth in her gentle rebuke. No, you deserve better, but as soon as I can stand, even with help, I want to ask you properly. And I don't want to wait months for a wedding. Then we shall compromise, she suggested. When you can stand without risk to your healing, you may ask your question, and if my answer is what you hope, we will marry when you can walk the length of the porch unassisted, even with a cane. It was a fair proposal, acknowledging his impatience while insisting on practical progress in his recovery. Typical of Fei-Yen's balanced approach to life's challenges. Agreed, he said, lifting her hand to his lips. I'll have new motivation for my exercises. She smiled, touching his face gently. You already had the best motivation, a future to build. The days that followed took on new purpose as Jackson dedicated himself to recovery. Each morning, Fei-Yen helped him with the strengthening exercises the doctor had prescribed. Each afternoon, he worked at moving from bed to chair and eventually, with the aid of crutches, taking short walks around his bedroom. The pain was considerable and progressed frustratingly slow. There were days when Jackson found himself sinking into dark thoughts, questioning whether he would ever regain enough strength to properly run Silver Creek. On those days, Fei-Yen's quiet presence was his anchor, her practical encouragement more effective than effusive sympathy would have been. Another step today than yesterday, she would observe, or your color is better this morning. Small acknowledgments of progress that kept his focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on limitations. Winter settled fully over Montana, snowdrifts piling against the ranch house, temperatures dropping to bitter lows that made the poorly healed bones in Jackson's leg ache fiercely. Yet inside, the house was warm and alive in ways it hadn't been since Charlotte's death. Fei-Yen had brought a sense of purpose and harmony to the household that extended beyond her care for Jackson. Martha confided that the ranch hands' wives, initially wary of the Chinese woman's prominent position, had come to respect her organizational skills and gentle authority. Even the most skeptical appreciated how she had fought to save Jackson's leg and her dedicated nursing afterward. Never seen a woman work harder, Martha told him during one of her daily visits. Up before dawn, checking on you, managing the house, studying the ranch accounts so she could report to you accurately. And always calm, always dignified, no matter what challenges arise. Jackson wasn't surprised by this assessment. He had witnessed Fei-Yen's strength of character from their first meeting. But hearing how others were coming to appreciate her filled him with pride and certainty that their future together, whatever its challenges, would be built on a solid foundation. By Christmas, Jackson could stand with the aid of crutches and take several steps without severe pain. Dr. Matthews, visiting between holiday calls, pronounced himself cautiously impressed with the progress. You've healed better than I expected, he admitted, examining the leg. Still, don't push too hard, the bones need time to strengthen. After the doctor departed, Jackson asked Hank to help him to the study. It was the first time he had left his bedroom since being carried into the house months earlier. The short journey exhausted him, but the change of scene and the familiar comfort of his father's desk revitalized his spirits. I need to see the accounts, he told the foreman, understand where we stand after the losses from the storm. Hank brought the ledgers, along with recent correspondence from their regular buyers and suppliers. For the next hour, they reviewed Silver Creek's position, financially stable despite the cattle lost in the ravine and the additional expenses of Jackson's medical care, but facing challenges from increased competition and changing market conditions. We need to think differently, Jackson mused, tapping a letter from a Chicago meat packer. They're looking for consistent quality, year-round supply, Our traditional approach of single large herds and seasonal drives may not serve us best moving forward. Hank raised an eyebrow. Been thinking along those lines yourself, have you? Fei-Yen suggested it actually, Jackson admitted. She sees possibilities I hadn't considered. The foreman nodded slowly. Smart woman. Sees things clearly. He hesitated, then added, the men have noticed how she's handled herself these past months. Even Johnston, who had the most reservations, commented yesterday that she has a good head for ranch matters. This was significant. Johnston was the most traditional of the hands, a man whose family had ranched in Pennsylvania for generations before coming west. His approval suggested a broader shift in how Fei-Yen was perceived by the Silver Creek community. I'm going to marry her, Hank, Jackson said directly, as soon as I can walk well enough to stand through a ceremony. The foreman showed no surprise. Figured as much. She's earned her place here, not just with you but with all of us. He rose, gathering the ledgers. For what it's worth, the hands will stand with you. Loyalty goes both ways at Silver Creek. The simple statement of support meant more to Jackson than elaborate endorsements from territorial officials or business associates ever could. These were the men who worked the land beside him, who had known him since boyhood, whose livelihoods were tied to Silver Creek's success. Their acceptance of Fei-Yen as his future wife was a foundation upon which other relationships could be built. Thank you, Jackson said, his voice rough with emotion. That means a great deal. The new year arrived with a heavy snowfall that isolated Silver Creek for nearly 2 weeks. Cut off from town and neighboring ranches, the household settled into a peaceful rhythm. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the ranch families would gather in the main house for shared meals, music, and companionship. To Jackson's delight, Fei-Yen gradually began sharing elements of Chinese culture during these gatherings, teaching the children simple phrases in her language, demonstrating traditional paper-folding techniques, telling stories from her childhood. The ranch wives were particularly interested in her medicinal knowledge, which had proven valuable during a bout of winter colds among the children. By February, Jackson had progressed to walking short distances with a cane. The limp was pronounced, and he tired quickly, but his mobility improved daily. He began joining the regular operations meetings, gradually resuming his role as decision-maker while delegating the physical aspects of ranch work that remained beyond his capabilities. It was after one such meeting, with the winter sun streaming through the study windows, that Jackson decided the time had come. Dismissing the others, he asked Fei-Yen to remain behind. "Would you walk with me?" he requested, rising carefully and taking his cane. She looked concerned. "It is cold outside, perhaps not wise to." "Just to the porch," he assured her. "I think I can manage that much now." Understanding dawned in her eyes. According to their agreement, once he could stand unassisted, he could properly propose. She nodded, helping him with his coat before donning her own. The winter air was crisp and clear as they stepped onto the porch. The valley before them, a pristine expanse of white broken only by the dark lines of fences and the cluster of ranch buildings. Jackson took a moment to steady himself, leaning on the cane but otherwise standing independently. "This view was what convinced my father to build here," he said, gesturing toward the mountains that framed the horizon. "He said a man could see his whole kingdom from this porch, and know it was good." Fei-Yen stood beside him, her presence warm despite the cold air. "He chose wisely. It is beautiful in every season." "It is," Jackson agreed. "But it was just land until people made it home." He turned to face her, maintaining his balance carefully. "You've made it home again, Fei-Yen, for me and for everyone at Silver Creek." She smiled, her cheeks pink from the cold. "It has become my home as well, more than any place since I left China." Jackson reached into his pocket, withdrawing the small box he had carried there every day since his return from town months earlier. It had been a talisman during his recovery, a reminder of the future he was fighting to secure. "I had planned to do this on one knee," he said ruefully, glancing at his injured leg. "But I think we both prefer I remain standing." Fei-Yen's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal the simple diamond ring within. Fei-Yen Huang, Jackson said, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his chest. You came into my life when I thought all joy had left it. You showed me that loss isn't the end of the story, just a chapter in it. You've faced every challenge with courage and grace and made Silver Creek better through your presence. He took her hand, feeling it tremble slightly within his. I love you. Will you marry me, be my partner in all things, build a future here together? Tears glistened in her dark eyes, catching the winter sunlight. Yes, she said simply. I will marry you, Jackson Lawson. I will be your wife and partner through whatever comes. With hands that shook slightly from more than the cold, Jackson placed the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, the diamond catching the light as if alive with fire. It's beautiful, she whispered, looking at the ring and then up at him with such love that it nearly stole his breath. Jackson drew her close, kissing her with all the tenderness and passion that had grown between them over the months of shared trials and quiet moments. In that kiss was a promise, of a future shaped by both their visions, of a love strong enough to withstand whatever the frontier might still demand of them. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Now I just need to walk the length of this porch unassisted, and we can be married. Fei-Yen smiled, her eyes bright with happy tears. I have complete faith in your determination. Though I warn you, I may be rather impatient. That makes two of us, he replied, kissing her again as the Montana winter surrounded them with its crystalline beauty, a fitting backdrop for the beginning of their life together. True to their agreement, preparations for the wedding began in earnest as Jackson's mobility continued to improve. By early March, he could walk the length of the porch with his cane, resting only once. By April, as the first signs of spring emerged across the valley, he achieved the goal, walking the entire porch without assistance other than the cane, which Dr. Matthews had confirmed would likely be a permanent companion. Reverend Wilson, after much prayer and contemplation, had agreed to perform the ceremony. His decision carried significant weight in the community, signaling that while not everyone might approve of the match, it would have the church's blessing. The legal paperwork was finalized, with Jennings creating a comprehensive set of documents that protected both Fei-Yen's rights as Jackson's wife and Silver Creek's continuity regardless of potential future legislation. The attorney had even suggested including language that might protect any children of the marriage from discriminatory inheritance laws. Better to anticipate problems than react to them, he advised when Jackson questioned the necessity of such detailed arrangements. The territory is changing, but not always for the better when it comes to Chinese residents. It was a sobering reminder of the challenges they would face. Yet as the wedding day approached, Jackson found himself focused not on potential difficulties, but on the joy of building a life with the woman he loved. Fei-Yen approached the wedding preparations with her characteristic blend of pragmatism and respect for tradition. She created a dress that honored both her Chinese heritage and her new life in Montana, red silk, the traditional color of Chinese brides, but cut in a Western style that would be familiar to the Silver Creek community. It represents who I am becoming, she explained when she showed the design to Martha. Not forgetting where I came from, but embracing where I am going. Word of the upcoming marriage spread throughout the county. Reactions were mixed, as expected. Some neighbors sent congratulations, others maintained a pointed silence. A few business associates wrote to express concerns about future relationships, though none went so far as to sever ties completely. Governor Hosser, to Jackson's surprise, sent a personal note. Montana's strength lies in the courage and vision of those who shape its future, without being bound by the limitations of the past. May your union bring prosperity to Silver Creek and the territory. My best wishes to you both. It was a diplomatic message, carefully worded to avoid explicit endorsement while conveying personal support. Jackson appreciated the political acumen it represented as well as the genuine good wishes underlying the formal language. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, when the valley would be in its spring glory. Invitations were sent to neighboring ranchers, business associates, and the few friends Fei-Yen had made during her time in the territory. Some declined, citing prior commitments or distance, but enough accepted to suggest the event would not be marked by complete social ostracism. As the day approached, Jackson found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Less than a year had passed since he rode to Fei-Yen's cabin to pay Charlotte's overdue wages. In that time he had moved from grief-stricken isolation to renewed purpose and unexpected love. His life had been transformed, not despite the hardships but partly because of them. The night before the wedding, he stood on the hillside where Charlotte and their son were buried. The spring grass was soft beneath his feet, the stars brilliant in the clear Montana sky. He had come to say goodbye in a sense, not to their memory, which he would always honor, but to the paralyzing grief that had nearly destroyed him. "I think you would approve," he said softly to the silent graves. "She's strong like you were. Sees beauty in this hard land, makes me want to be better." The night wind was his only answer, but it carried the scent of new growth and possibility. Charlotte would always be part of his past, a love that had shaped him. But Fei-Yen was his future, a love born from the ashes of loss but burning with its own unique fire. As he turned to walk back to the house, moving carefully with his cane across the uneven ground, Jackson felt a sense of completion. Tomorrow he would marry Fei-Yen, formally uniting their lives. But in all the ways that truly mattered, they had already become a family, supporting each other through crisis, building shared dreams, creating a home where both could flourish. Silver Creek Ranch spread before him in the moonlight, solid and enduring. It had been his father's vision, his own burden, and was now becoming their shared legacy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their love as resilient as the land that had brought them together. Dawn broke clear and warm on the wedding day, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed designed for new beginnings. Silver Creek Ranch had been transformed for the occasion, the yard swept clean, the house decorated with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding meadows, tables set up beneath newly leafed cottonwood trees for the celebration to follow. Inside, Fei-Yen prepared with the help of Martha and several of the ranch wives. Her red silk dress, months in the making, caught the morning light as she stood before the mirror in what had once been Charlotte's room. "You look beautiful," Martha said, adjusting the small veil that was Fei-Yen's concession to Western bridal traditions. "Jackson won't know what hit him." Fei-Yen smiled, touching the jade comb in her hair, a family heirloom that had survived the journey from China and the flood that destroyed her cabin. "In my country, it is said that a bride who marries in spring will have good fortune all her life." "Well, we could all use some good fortune," Martha replied practically. "Though you and Jackson seem to have found yours already, despite everything." There was truth in the observation. Against considerable odds, they had found each other and built a connection strong enough to withstand both personal tragedy and social disapproval. Whatever challenges lay ahead, that foundation would support them. Meanwhile, in his study, Jackson prepared with Hank's assistance. His formal suit, ordered from Chicago months earlier, fit well despite the weight he had lost during his recovery. The cane at his side was new, a gift from the ranch hands, carved from polished oak with a silver handle inscribed with his initials. "Nervous?" Hank asked as Jackson adjusted his tie for the third time. "Not about marrying Fei-Yen," Jackson replied honestly. "Just about doing right by her. The life we're choosing won't be easy." The foreman nodded, understanding the concerns that went beyond normal wedding day jitters. "Nothing worthwhile comes easy on the frontier, but that woman has proven her strength a dozen times over, and so have you." Jackson appreciated the straightforward encouragement. "Did I ever thank you properly? For getting me down that mountain alive." "Wasn't just me," Hank said gruffly. "Every hand played their part. That's how it works at Silver Creek. We take care of our own." "And Fei-Yen? Do they see her as one of our own now?" The older man considered this. "Most do. The rest will come around in time. She's earned her place here same as any of us." It was the best reassurance Jackson could hope for. Not perfect acceptance, but respect earned through shared hardship and demonstrated character. The rest would indeed come with time. By mid-morning, guests began arriving, neighboring ranchers and their families, business associates from town, even a representative from Governor Hosser's office, suggesting the political significance the Union held in territorial affairs. They gathered in the large front yard where chairs had been arranged facing the porch steps. Reverend Wilson arrived early, speaking quietly with Jackson about the ceremony and offering last-minute spiritual guidance. "Are you certain of this path?" he asked, his lined face serious beneath the white hair. Jackson nodded without hesitation, "More certain than I've been of anything in my life." The Reverend studied him, then smiled slightly. "I believe you. There's a piece about you now that was missing before. Perhaps this union, unconventional as it may be, is indeed God's plan for your healing." At 11 o'clock, with spring sunshine bathing the assembled guests, the ceremony began. Jackson took his place beside Reverend Wilson at the foot of the porch steps, standing straight and strong despite the cane at his side. Hank stood nearby as his witness, solid and dependable as always. A hush fell over the gathering as Martha appeared from the house, followed by Fei-Yen in her red silk dress, carrying a simple bouquet of wildflowers. A few murmurs rippled through the guests, some admiring, others perhaps less so, but Jackson heard nothing beyond the beating of his own heart as she descended the steps to join him. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she took her place beside him. Her smile, radiant and sure, was all the answer he needed. Reverend Wilson began the ceremony with a prayer, followed by words about the sacred nature of marriage and its importance in civilized society. He spoke of how love transcended boundaries of nation and custom, finding its truest expression in commitment and sacrifice. "Marriage on the frontier," he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "requires particular strength and devotion. The challenges faced by those who build lives in this territory demand partnerships founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. I have observed such qualities in the couple before us today." The acknowledgement, coming from the community's spiritual leader, carried significant weight. Jackson sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere among the guests, not universal approval perhaps, but a willingness to consider the union in terms of its substance rather than merely its unconventional nature. When the time came for vows, Jackson and Fei-Yen had chosen to speak their own words rather than repeat traditional phrases that didn't fully capture their unique journey. "Fei-Yen," Jackson began, his voice steady and clear, "I come to you having known both joy and sorrow, having built and lost and built again. I bring to our marriage my strengths and my weaknesses, my dreams for the future and my respect for the past. I promise to stand beside you in all seasons, to honor your heritage as you have honored mine, to build with you a home where both our traditions find welcome." He paused, emotion momentarily tightening his throat. "I promise to love you with constancy and courage, to face whatever challenges come our way with the same strength I have seen in you, and to consider our partnership the greatest blessing of my life." Fei-Yen's eyes glistened with tears as she responded, her accented voice carrying a dignity and certainty that touched even the most skeptical observers. "Jackson, I journey to this moment across oceans and mountains, through loss and discovery. I bring to our marriage my determination and hope, my respect for what you have built, and my vision for what we may build together. I promise to stand with you in times of plenty and of hardship, to blend my traditions with yours in creating a home unlike any other, yet true to both our hearts." She took a breath, her voice strengthening. "I promise to love you with patience and passion, to face the world's doubts with the certainty I feel in my heart, and to walk beside you on whatever path life opens before us." The simple eloquence of their promises silenced even those who might have come expecting to disapprove. These were not frivolous young people acting on impulse, but mature individuals who had found in each other the strength to overcome past tragedies and build a shared future. Reverend Wilson proceeded with the exchange of rings, Jackson's a wide gold band, Fei-Yen's the diamond ring he had given her months before, now accompanied by a matching wedding band. As they slipped the symbols of commitment onto each other's fingers, the significance of the moment seemed to transcend the individual ceremony, representing a larger joining of different worlds and traditions. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana and Almighty God," the Reverend concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Jackson leaned forward to kiss his bride, a gentle but firm gesture that sealed their union before the assembled witnesses. As they turned to face the gathering, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Lawson of Silver Creek Ranch, the applause that greeted them was genuine if not universal, a reflection of the complex reality they would navigate together. The celebration that followed displayed the same blending of traditions that characterized their relationship. Tables laden with Western barbecue shared space with dishes Fei-Yen had taught Martha to prepare, introducing the ranch community to flavors many had never experienced. Music from fiddles and guitars filled the spring air, and if some guests kept to themselves rather than fully embracing the occasion, enough participated wholeheartedly to make the day a success. Governor Hauser's representative approached during the festivities, offering formal congratulations and a small gift, a legal document granting Fei-Yen special territorial citizenship status, a protection against potential future restrictions on Chinese residents. "The governor believes in recognizing those who contribute to Montana's development," the man explained discreetly, "regardless of origin." It was a significant gesture of political support, one that acknowledged both the potential vulnerabilities of their situation and the respect they had earned among the territory's leadership. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Jackson found a quiet moment with his new wife at the edge of the celebration. Standing together overlooking the valley that was now truly their shared domain, he felt a sense of completion that transcended the day's formal proceedings. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Fei-Yen leaned against him, her expression serene in the golden light of sunset. "Very happy, Mr. Lawson, and you?" "More than I thought possible a year ago," he admitted. "When I rode to your cabin that day, I was just going through the motions of living. Now I feel like my life is truly beginning again." She nodded, understanding the journey he had traveled from grief to renewal. In China, there is a belief that souls who are meant to find each other will do so, regardless of obstacles. Perhaps it was not chance that brought you to my door. "Those kittens certainly helped," Jackson said with a smile, glancing toward the barn where the now-grown cats had established themselves as efficient mousers. The Gray One warrior had become particularly attached to Fei-Yen, following her about the ranch like a devoted shadow. "They were our beginning," she agreed, "but we have built something far beyond that small connection." Looking across Silver Creek Ranch as twilight gathered, Jackson knew she was right. They had built something remarkable, a marriage that honored both their pasts while creating something entirely new, a home that welcomed different traditions and perspectives, a future that promised both challenges and joys unique to their unconventional union. The frontier that had taken so much from both of them had, in the end, given them each other. And together, they would continue to shape this land even as it shaped them, their love as enduring as the Montana mountains that witnessed their joining. As darkness fell and the last guests departed, Jackson and Fei-Yen Lawson stood together on the porch of their home, no longer separated by grief or circumstance or cultural differences. They had chosen each other, defying convention and embracing possibility. And in that choice was the promise of a future limited only by the scope of their shared dreams. The widowed rancher who had ridden out to pay a Chinese widow her wages had found not just a woman feeding orphaned kittens, but the partner with whom he would write the next chapter of Silver Creek's story. And it would be a story unlike any the Montana Territory had seen before, built on love that transcended boundaries, resilience that overcame hardship, and hope that looked always toward tomorrow.